good all the way. I've got my little thing. So
Rock on. All right. We already got some things. Hashtag stay safe. Yes. And also happy Easter. That is a thing today.
Yeah.
I was told several times throughout the week, but it wasn't until last night that I was like, oh, yeah, that is a thing tomorrow, isn't it?
Yeah, so here is your social distancing / quarantine style way that I think everyone should celebrate Easter. It's a super, super fun idea, and it takes from, Easter beer hunt that I used to have semi-annually. But you can do this. You get a bunch of bottles of beer, homebrew or otherwise, and you decorate those like Easter eggs. Then you go to your neighbors or friends or family's house, hide them all around their yard, and just call them later. It'll be a fun surprise for them. You'll have an excuse to have beer, and then you've Eastered.
Then you've Eastered?
Then you've Eastered.
No, Easter, I call it Beerster egg hunts, actually.
Beerster egg?
That's what I like to call it. They're fantastic for adult Easter egg hunting. Smaller the bottle, the better it is. It means you can hide them even more so. And the beauty of bottles is if you really are paranoid about microbes and germs, you can always dunk them in some bleach water before you go and hide them in the woods. So.
That's right. And, depending on how long they've been in the woods for, that might not be the worst idea afterwards, too.
And or in Peter's hands.
What?
All right. Well, let's get into it. I believe we have quite a few people tuned in now. So let's start with some Genus news.
Yeah. So we launched our recipe kits and published the video for that on, what was that, Saturday or is that Monday that we published the video?
Friday. Friday?
Nailed it.
Yes, Friday.
And we've had an incredible response, so thank you so much to the people who have already bought kits. I was going to get a list and then name you guys off, but I don't have that in front of me right now. So just thank you guys that have bought kits. That's really, we appreciate that. That's
we definitely were surprised on Saturday morning when we when we woke up and pulled up our website and we're like, oh, we got some work to do. So we have those for the most part built out for everyone, especially if anyone's tuned in right now. Unfortunately, we missed the deadline for shipping yesterday, so we will try to get those out ASAP on Monday morning for you. So far, it seems like it's only been taking a few days to get to locations. So
those all should be in your hands by the end of the week.
Pretty much.
When you get those kits, be sure to post them on social media and just let us know. Also reach out to us and say, hey, by the way, these kits came in great condition, or hey, by the way, the shipping person just drop kicked my kit or something like that, and it looks weird now. So.
Yeah, hopefully those all get there in one piece and in a timely manner, though. So
yeah.
Also, what did we do?
We tapped the last beer that we made before the shutdown, and that was unfortunately it was a really large batch of IPA. West Coast style IPA. We made a really big batch of that before everything got closed down here. And so we wanted to make sure we still got that on tap and hopefully get as much of it out while it's fresh. But obviously now that we are shut down, we're going to be burning through beer a lot slower than normal.
So if you do want fresh IPA, it did just get kegged up this week.
That's right.
It is fresh as of now. So please come get it while you can.
Our one saving grace is it's the only IPA on tap, which means it's probably going to go pretty fast.
Yeah, and it's a good IPA, so
yeah.
There's that too.
Obviously.
Also, what else has been going on here other than those kits? We have just been sort of chugging along. We've actually seen a little bit of an uptake, I would say, in our homebrew supply sales. We've had a lot of people sort of coming back, dusting off their homebrew equipment.
Or starting in the first place.
Which actually I think kind of is a great transition into general beer news, and that is a resurgence in homebrewing.
You've probably already seen it. It's going on worldwide, actually, but a lot of people that have access to homebrew supply they've been starting to homebrew a lot more. So here in the shop, we've seen that as an actual increase in our homebrew supply sales, which is beautiful because overall sales are going to be down a lot because of not being able to sell beer in the tap room. But it's nice because, if we'd have seen these numbers in the old homebrew supply store before we were a tap room / brewery, then we would have been really, really happy. So
yeah, and right now it is actually saving our butts because we have a significantly higher cost here, and considering our beer sales are less than half of what they were before, it's a good thing to have backing up our business plan, I guess, business model. There we go. That's a better way to put it.
Our handful of guys that just kind of show up here and try to make stuff happen.
Yeah, because we totally planned. This wasn't our business plan too. Having a viral outbreak and shutting everything down for 2 months.
It was us. We admit it. What else? What's next?
Also, beer cocktails, I think, might be a sort of new and upcoming thing now that everybody will be flush with beer.
Yeah. So we've seen a lot of people already doing like homebrew happy hours, not homebrew happy hours, but just like virtual happy hours.
Virtual happy hours, yeah.
Yeah, they're doing the mixology with what they have in their houses, and a lot of that has kind of, I think, boomed a little bit of the trying to make cocktails at home worlds too. So obviously, put those two things together. You've got people who like beer. You've got people who are trying their hand at mixology. Beer cocktails, is that something you guys are interested in? Tell us.
I know we did one video on a beer cocktail. I think some people weren't quite into it, but yeah. It all depends on your thing, and it can turn out very well as long as you have somewhat of an idea of what you're mixing and the flavor profile you're trying to achieve.
So let us know. Let us know if that's something you're interested in, because we actually enjoyed branching out and doing different things. A lot of what we do here for our videos does involve, a fair bit of research and a bit of like brainstorming on what we haven't done yet. And so if we can break out into a whole new genre, then that kind of helps us out a little bit too.
So if you're not into beer cocktails, you can be like Waldemar Wolter. That's an awesome name, by the way. He thinks that we should all just go out and drink random stuff we find in the woods, which I agree. That is a fantastic idea.
Well, that probably comes from last Easter beer hunt that somebody left there.
Oh yeah. Hopefully it was like a big beer at least, like a good barley wine or something.
Oh yeah. Well, if you look on the back of Dogfish Head's 120-minute IPA, they do say to bury some, and then find it a couple of years later. So
they actually say that? I've never read the label.
That's on the label for Dogfish Head's 120-minute IPA. As long as
if you get it like maybe like 2 feet, 3 feet down,
it's probably good selling.
It should be okay, right? Yeah, I was gonna say it might get a little cold in the winter, but in the summertime, it should stay nice and cool.
Well, it depends on where you're at. If you're in Minnesota, it's probably gonna freeze several feet deep.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you might end up with a broken bottle then. All right. Anyway, I think that sums up our beer news. So let's go on to our
beer of the week. Bump, bump, bump. Beer of the week.
Boo, boo. Nailed it.
100%. That's the official jingle for beer of the week now.
Ah, crap. That actually reminds me. I totally forgot to look up the BJCP for this.
Don't worry. I've got an app.
You got an app. All right. So we're going to look up the BJCP because our beer of the week is a Munich Helles, which luckily we're already somewhat familiar with.
Yeah. So a Munich Helles basically it's a pale style German lager, originated somewhere around I want to say like the mid 1800s, maybe the early 1800s, back when a bunch of monkeys were going into the Bavaria region, and basically what it is, it's a super sessionable malt forward light lager. Doesn't focus on the hop bitterness at all, although some small amounts of hop taste can be a thing. And talking and searching for an app on my phone is really great multitasking.
Pale malty lager, that is going to be category 4A. Found on apparently just page 6 of the 2015 BJCP guidelines. It's 2020 now. Honestly, I feel like BJCP
Pale malty lager. There we go.
Should update their stuff.
Yeah.
Let's be real. Everybody should yell at BJCP and be like, come on, guys, 2020.
Well, the 2015 one, that was, 15, 20 years in the making? So, I think we got a little while before they probably try to redo that. Impression is it's a clean, malty, gold-colored German lager with a smooth, grainy, sweet malt flavor, a soft, dry finish, subtle spice, floral or herbal hops, and restrained bitterness to help keep the balance malty but not sweet. All that sounds to me like just a great malt-leaning light lager with a hint of that hop maybe taste, but not so much the bitterness.
Yeah, and I think the key, at least for my experience from Munich Helles and Helles in general, is that, and to really capture the essence of that style, is the fact that it is smooth and malty, and yet still a pale colored beer. And that's the thing, is a lot of people don't really think of malt forward profiles in these pale colored, light colored beers, where while this one is a light colored beer, it is actually a very malty beer.
It is.
That's part of what actually is going to separate it from a lot of Pilsners too.
Yeah. Historically, doesn't say too much. Historically, created in Munich in 1894, at the Spaten Brewery to compete with pale Pilsner type beers, currently the most popular style in southern Germany. Nice. I can actually see that being more popular than something like a Pilsner, just because that malt leaning kind of, essence, that kind of goes along with, how Americans do lagers too.
Yep.
You want something that's not too well, in the whole 1990s, we had that bitter beer face commercial. That was a huge part of like Miller and their branding.
Yep. So compared to a Pilsner, obviously there's going to be less of a hop forward character. In something like a Munich Helles, you're going to be pretty constrained actually on the hops you're going to throw at it. With that said, IBUs can still be 16 to 22, so nothing super low, nothing like a wheat beer or anything like
or
that.
American lager.
Or American lager, yes, which is going to be even less. Also, an interesting thing about Helles is their attenuation. So it's got a pretty wide range for the guidelines, which is anywhere between 1006, which is very low, and 1.012, which would definitely be on the high side. I know whenever we try to do a beer like this, we actually, this is one of those rare-ish occasions where we really try to do a step mash, and we really try to hit one of those protein rest when we're doing our all-grain batches. And that's really going to help with, for one, overall attenuation, and two, it's going to help without getting too sweet of a flavor profile to the beer. So these things are typically have an OG of 1044 of 1048 in American versions. You're going to often see that to be a bit higher, but still with those high attenuations, which brings us to another sort of methodology in brewing a Helles, which is going to be pretty low saccharification mash temps. So honestly, shoot for about 145 and then slowly build that up to 160. That's going to give you your most fermentable mash in the end, which really helps with that attenuation, helps with that crispness on the finish, and makes it so that beer just doesn't get too thick and too chewy.
Another thing that's interesting about Munich Helles is that its water profile is starkly different from a lot of other traditional German beers. It's not going to be as minerally as something like a classic Pilsner. It's going to be a little bit softer and leans on the alkaline side. Actually, a Munich Helles is a more similar water profile to what we have here, just if it was toned down a little bit, where both the sulfates and the chlorides are really low. And so that does help it with being more malt leaning, just the fact that it doesn't have that extra minerality, because extra minerals kind of brighten things up a little bit and make them, they have that metallic-y kind of taste that really accentuates hops.
Make them a little poppier. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Without overdoing it. I mean, let's be real. Don't push your bicarbonate levels to 300 parts per million.
I think somewhere in like that 50 to 60 range is pretty solid for those bicarbonate
which is going to
levels.
be a lot softer than most people's municipal water. And so water is something that you definitely need to take into consideration if you're really trying to emulate that classic Munich Helles, especially if you've been to Germany and actually had one fresh. I have never had that opportunity, unfortunately, but nailing that water chemistry is going to be a really big part of brewing a Helles properly and getting that really soft malty character to them.
That's right. And fun story about the Munich Helles and like the Pilsners and lagers in Germany when light beers came out. There was actually kind of an interesting war that was going on that led into the creation of all these German-style light lagers that got popular in the mid-1800s. And that had to do with basically people in the malt world trying to make diastatic and sugar content rich malts that still had a light color, because before then the lightest they could make was like a Marzen style, where it was sort of that orangey hue, but then science kind of came around and some maltsters were actually competing for making the lightest grain possible, which is where we started getting those Pilsner style grains that could make these fantastic light lagers. And that's why you got that huge boom of light lagers from the mid 1800s to the, I would say, early 1900s, even when some Germans came over to like America and started doing the pre-prohibition style lagers.
Yep, so let's go on to our malt of the week. Speaking about lighter malts, and that is one of our favorites, which is actually sort of an oddball specialty malt, and that is the Franco-Belge's special aromatic malt.
Special aromatic, yes.
And this is actually different than most aromatic malts. When you see aromatic malts, like we've talked about in some of our malt series videos, the aromatic malts are often also referred to as biscuit malts, and typically they have a little bit higher color, generally between that like 20 Lovibond and up to even like 40 Lovibond range, which is also associated with a lot of like I said, biscuit, or a lot of sort of toasty notes to them.
Biscuits, melanoidins. I mean, Victory kind of falls into that same biscuit category. But a lot of these, when you want that malt punch kind of malts, a lot of these do fall into that 20 Lovibond, around there, higher or lower a little bit range. But the Franco-Belgian Special Aromatic actually falls much, much lower. So
yeah, we looked it up, and it is actually only a target of, it's 4.3, I think, is the target Lovibond for it.
Yeah.
Which explains why we actually love that malt so much. It has this warmth to it, and it has this just overall very, very mellow profile that allows you to use it in higher quantities, even in lighter beers. Beers like, for instance, our Castermuncher, we actually have, I believe, a half pound of it in there, which if you were using some of the other biscuit malts, would be a pretty pungent profile, but instead that half pound just gives it a nice roundness.
So if you want that Munich on steroids punch, but without a ton of color that might be associated with it, because you still want a nice light beer, the Franco-Belgian Special Aromatic is a phenomenal malt to use.
Yep. So it gives you that breadiness. It gives you, in fact, that would be another great, I think, sort of pseudo thing if you don't have access to something like a Maris Otter malt. It's not probably going to have much of the nuttiness that Maris Otter has, but some of that extra breadiness. I think that it would be a great way to use that at a point of maybe 10 to even 20% of your grain bill.
Yeah.
To sort of fake a Maris Otter if you just have some Pilsner malt or some pale malt.
Base 2-row or something like that.
Some pale 2-row sitting around. So a great malt to have on hand. It's a fantastic, just sort of kind of filling in the gaps malt.
We use it a lot. Yeah.
We use it a lot. So.
It gives you that nice middle you want without being too obtrusive. It ain't going to hurt nothing if you accidentally use a little bit too much.
Yeah. In fact, it says that on their website that you can use up to 50% in the grain bill. So if you really want to push that breadiness through. So let's go on to our hop of the week. And that hop is going to be Crystal hops. And Crystal is... like a few other hops, including Mount Hood and, I can't quite remember the other one. But there was a few hops that came out of the breeding program.
Mount Hood Sterling probably is in that same range?
No, it wasn't Sterling. I can't remember what it was now.
Okay.
But it is the American response.
Cluster?
No,
Cluster's an American. Yeah. No, that's a traditional American varietal. That was a dumb thing to say. Like, what's going on? What's in that range?
To essentially trying to emulate some of the traditional German hop varieties, things like Hallertau, things like Spalt. And it is actually a daughter of Hallertau and a mutt, I guess, of some American hops, including Cascade and, I guess, Brewer's Gold.
Yeah, everything pretty much in America is some sort of a mutt that comes from Brewer's Gold. Brewer's Gold is like the OG American, like let's let hops run wild in America hops. So a lot of hops in America are actually derivatives of Brewer's Gold. Yeah,
so came out of the same breeding program as Mount Hood, so it has a lot of those traditional...
Seth Johnson says Liberty?
Yeah. Actually, yes. I think it was Liberty.
I was going to say that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Liberty came out of the same breeding program.
He did the research on this. I didn't.
Yep. So it came out of Oregon State too. Woohoo! One of my alma maters. And in 1983 too, like way back in the day. And it is kind of grown in hop acreage slowly but steady ever since then. And it really does a great job as a replacement for Hallertau, especially in this day and age when, honestly, we've had a really hard time getting Hallertau, especially fresh Hallertau, over the last 6 months or so. I don't know what the deal is. I don't know if Germany's hop acreage is doing something weird or what, but yeah, we have had a hard time getting a hold of some Hallertau. So, things like Liberty or even maybe Mount Hood are some fantastic American substitutes if you are trying to brew your lager. As for a flavor profile of this... Nailed it. Now I can't talk.
So someone said, what about the robin's egg? So I think we should both eat a robin's egg. By the way, hit the like button or the like thumbs up if you were impressed by that toss and catch on the fly.
We are more than 6 feet apart for the record. This is a solid 8 feet.
We're a good distance separated.
I mean, I should be like a solid 6 inches, right?
Solid 6 inches apart. That's at night. What were we talking about?
We're talking about the flavor profile of Crystal hops.
Yeah, so Crystal's got that classic, lemony grassiness that Hallertau has. Just a subtle earth quality without being like overly. What is your wife doing?
I don't know.
Without being overly overly aggressive or overly like citrusy, like something like a Saaz could be in that same world. Yeah, that's all I got.
That's all you got? Yeah. So another thing I found actually researching it that I didn't know until kind of looking it up is that despite the fact that it has fairly low alpha acid content, generally going to be between like 3 and 5-ish%, it actually has a very high cohumulone content.
Sorry, wife.
What? Oh, okay.
She said those are not for me to eat.
Oh, it has a high cohumulone content relative to the alpha acids. So what does this mean when you're brewing with it? It means that it actually has a pretty pungent bittering impact to your beer. So this is going to taste more bitter than a softer hop or a hop that doesn't have quite as much of a cohumulone content to it. So this is very interesting. It means that beers that you put this in will have that little bit of a co-punch at the end, is what we like to call that around here.
Co-punch.
Yeah.
By the way, we got 4 more likes from that egg tossing catch.
Nice.
Thank you for people who thumbs up us because of the egg tossing catch. Someone said that we might brew with the eggs. That would be very difficult to brew with robin's eggs, though not impossible. Brewing with actual made chocolate is difficult because you have to have some sort of a process to separate out the oils from the actual chocolate flavor.
Yeah, that didn't work so well.
Yeah, you either end up with like not any chocolate flavor and a normal beer, or you end up with the chocolate flavor, but it's also kind of like oily and rests on top of the actual beer. But if you use a tincture and some other agitating methods, you can actually separate those two things out.
Well, all right. Now let's get back to our beer of the week.
Yeast of the week. Bow, wow, wow, wow.
Yeast of the week. Dun, dun. So yeast of the week is nothing very fancy. In fact, I think we've talked about the same strain before.
Probably a couple times. It might be one of our favorite yeasts.
Might be one of our favorite yeasts, and that is going to be the Weinsteffen lager strain. Specifically for this one, we're going to talk about the yeast that we actually are shipping out with our kits as well, and that is the 3470 yeast from Fermentis. Wow.
That's right. Yeah, 3470 is a lager strain, ferments super clean at a low temperature and a high temperature. And when we talk about the genetics of yeast later on in this episode, we might actually get into why that may be.
Yeah. So yeah, fantastic yeast strain all around, just very, very clean, very, very vigorous fermenter, even at low temperatures. I mean, even in the mid 50s, this thing will chew through some beer. So yeah, the good old Fermentis, especially if you can't get a hold of liquid packs. This is a really, really great yeast to honestly just have a few packs sitting in your fridge for whenever you decide to use it.
You can make IPAs with it. You can make porties with it. You can make lagers with it.
Yeah, I mean, I just throw it at everything. But
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Sours. We've done sours with it before, too.
All right. Well, that sums up our beer of the week, which is the Munich Helles, something that, honestly, I think we need to brew. That's probably going to be one of our next lagers that we do.
Yeah.
And, so let's go on to our main topic, and that is all about lagers. Hey, speaking of which.
What? It's like we meant to do all this kind of together on the same theme for an episode. Weird.
So let's go down. Let's do a quick breakdown first for everyone of the history, because I think there's a lot of people out there watching that aren't quite as familiar with really the history of lagers or really what a lager is and how it differs from an ale.
Yeah, so to start out with, initially a lot of people think that lagers are just either a specific breed of yeast or just a yeast or just a beer that's fermented cold, or it just means it's bottom fermenting. And technically, bottom fermenting is right, or I should say was right, 10 years ago. But there's a lot more that goes into lagers, because the biggest thing that makes a lager is actually the storage.
Yep. So lagering is simply the fancy, term for cold storage. It means that you're storing a beer cold for a long period of time. And, with even ales, a lot of times you'll do that with. But
yeah, so you can lager ales.
Yeah, you can lager an ale, pretty much. Fun facts.
Psych.
So that's all lager means, but historically, where brewers' yeast today came from is, at least what they think where they came from, is actually Patagonia area of South America. Obviously this can't be proven, but the theory is that the sailing ships that were going back and forth around the world at the time brought some what was then known as Saccharomyces eubayanus across the seas back over to Europe, in which it spread and contaminated all the beers. Who knows how they were tasting back in the day. And then ultimately what happened is, as it got into warmer beers. People that were trying to turn fresh beers over, places up in the Belgian region. It evolved into our modern day Saccharomyces cerevisiae as we know it. And then for the beers that were being brewed in, well, probably wasn't even Germany yet, but the more German area region, where they were actually putting their beer in the caves, the cold temperatures actually selected for different characteristics, the traditional bottom fermenting characteristics that Peter mentioned. And so that yeast evolved into Saccharomyces pastorianus. And that is really how we got lager yeast and ale yeast. It just really has to do with selection from the temperatures the beer was being stored at.
There has been a lot of debate in the last, probably since the 1980s, but especially with our ability to microbiologically study these things in terms of actually tracking down the true history of the yeast. And the earliest known origins of bottom fermenting yeast actually date back to the 14th century. But obviously it's really hard to kind of track through the genetics of the yeast that we can actually pull out now which original strain they came from. But we'll get into evolution a little bit later. Let's talk about the two types that they have that are the most commonly used lager yeasts that we can find today, which might go into why 3470 is good at multiple temperatures. So the two biggest types of lager yeast that are used today. One is called a Saz type, which is an aloe triploid, and it. So, to take a step back, I'm kind of rambling a little bit. Sorry about that. Basically, the current lager yeast, the Saccharomyces pastorianus, is thought to be a cross between Cerevisiae and Eubayanus. And there's been a lot of hey, is it Eubayanus? Is it Euvarum? Is it all that? But there is a set of yeasts that are nearly an exact genomic match for both Cerevisiae and Eubayanus, and that's the Pastorianus that we have, which 3470 falls into. The reason that this is important is because this is the only type of lager yeast that has the majority of its Cerevisiae genomics. So since it still has its Cerevisiae genomics intact, that might explain why 3470 is a good hybrid strain.
Yeah, so ultimately, after genetic sequencing became popular, it was actually White Labs, I think, was the company that ended up taking a bunch of our known yeast strains, and they actually did a genetic sequence and breakdown, and that was some years ago now. I think that was back in
14.
Yeah, it was. I remember it came out when I was working, but back in probably 15 or 16. Yeah. So anyway, what they actually determined was that a lot of what we think of as traditional lager strains, the Weinsteffen strain included in those, are actually these hybrid yeast strains. And what essentially has happened is that they have characteristics of a Cerevisiae strain, which are typically known for producing ester profiles, those fruity notes in beers that you get from a lot of ale strains. So they have some of those characteristics of being able to ferment warm and ferment vigorously, but they actually lost the characteristics that actually produce those fruity notes. And what that ends up meaning when you throw it into a beer is that you can ferment these yeast cold like a traditional lager strain, but if you ferment them warm, they don't produce those fruity notes regardless, because they've actually lost their genetic ability to actually produce those flavors.
So you can get some neutral beers no matter what temperature you ferment them at.
Pretty much, no matter what, yeah. I think homebrewers actually knew that even before that came out. I know people were definitely experimenting with that for a while, and finding that, hey, wait a second, this lager fermented at 75 degrees.
Why doesn't it taste like a fruit bomb?
Yeah, why is it still clean?
How is it popsicle?
That's my wife. Oh, she has a key.
She's got a key.
That's cool. So really, really interesting things coming out about lagers, about ales, and the hybrids between them, about your wild type strains. I think that was I couldn't remember which one that was, but that was one of them that you mentioned earlier. The wild type strains are obviously going to be more along your lines of Belgian ales, your saisons, weird things like that, your diastaticus variants, all those crazy ones. Even wine yeast, I think, fall into that same category. which that's a whole nother topic that we're not actually going to get into today.
There's a lot that goes into actually even classifying yeast in the first place. Because we haven't been able to genetically categorize them until a solid 10 years ago. So a lot of that, and it's still heavily debated. There's not a consensus in the science world as to where these yeasts should be categorized.
Yeah, and with that said, not every yeast is going to be a hybrid. So do take that into consideration. I do know
the Saz type, the allotriploids. Those are the ones that need to be those clean bottom fermenting types, because they've either lost or bastardized a lot of their original Cerevisiae side.
Yeah. Speaking about beers from Munich, I think the Munich lager strain is one of those that's not a hybrid. Yep. I know that we have fermented that warm, and it definitely starts throwing really, really big raisiny notes, raisiny kind of like date and plum characteristics.
Handful of fusids.
Which, depending on the beer, it might be good. Like last week we said, use that one in a beer and ferment it warm. So
yeah.
But for something like a Helles, probably wouldn't be the best situation to end up in. I don't know about a raisin Helles. That might not be the best situation. So. Bam. Somebody's asking about, California ale. Yes, that's a top fermenting yeast. At the same time, not a true top cropper in my opinion. Fun facts, conical fermenters, which is what all the commercial breweries use, more or less create bottom fermentations regardless of the yeast strain. That's actually part of the reason why as you scale up from homebrew as to a commercial brewery and go to conicals, you actually want to up your pitch rate and pretty much double it if you can.
And then go into some other yeast taken care of mechanisms that we haven't previously had.
So,
by the way, just throwing this out there, I just found one of these here, which means I think the Easter Bunny did arrive at the brewery today. So I'm gonna put that in a special spot in case somebody wants to come in later and look for that and all the other eggs that are definitely hidden here because the Easter Bunny was here.
All right. Well, enough about the history. Let's go on to commercial breweries and really why you can judge a commercial brewery through their lager.
One of the reasons we love to make lagers is because it shows off techniques that not everyone can pull off. Making lagers is a difficult process because, first of all, there's nothing to hide behind. Lagers are very clean beers, and so any flaws are like right there. And second of all, there's a lot of patience and a lot of yeast care that goes into making them properly.
Yeah, lagers take up, for one, they take more time than a traditional fast, quickly fermented ale. They're going to usually take at least a week or two longer, sometimes more if it's a higher gravity beer. So for one, they're expensive for breweries to make because, the more time you have beer sitting in a fermenter or bright tank, the less time you have to turn another batch of beer over in there. So if somebody's actually doing a lager, it means that they are taking the time and effort and expense to do it and do it right.
Yeah. Another reason that lagers say a lot about breweries is because there actually is a wide range of lagers, and they all take, specified techniques to pull off correctly. So they take an attention to nuance to make different kind of lagers. If you see a brewery out there that has both a Helles and a Pilsner on tap, you know that they're paying attention to nuance because there are defined differences, not only in the ingredients that go into those lagers, but in the water chemistry and how those beers ferment. So being able to do something like what Chuck and Nut does, where they have multiple light lagers on tap, that really shows that they have an attention to detail that not a lot of breweries can pull off.
Yeah, and that's another really, really big thing is that a lot of, especially small breweries, even local ones, from what I've talked to, a lot of people are more or less ignoring water chemistry, and water chemistry is a huge deal for lagers, especially if you're trying to emulate a lot of those European waters where it's drastically different from a lot of the water in America, and especially here on the West Coast. We got pretty high. Actually, we got pretty good water here. I take it back. We got nice water to work with. It's not too bad. But either way, adjusting the water profile. A lot of times when we do lagers here, we have zero sodium in our water, and in most areas of Czech Republic, Germany, you name it. They're going to have at least a little bit of salt, and that salt actually helps add a overall roundness to the finish of a beer, of a traditional lager, which is what everybody expects to. So if you don't have that, you're going to almost always end up with a drier, maybe slightly sharper finish. There's other things that are involved in that too, but without getting too much down the rabbit hole about water chemistry, it is essential. It is important to at the least consider and at least look up before brewing a lager.
That's hitting on the sodium. That's actually really good points, and that's something I want to touch on, because a lot of people, when they're trying to balance their chlorides to sulfate ratios, they'll use calcium chloride, which means, number one, their calcium is going to be far out of balance. You'll have like a 10-to-1 calcium to magnesium ratio, or you just have a lot of calcium in general. But then also you're forgetting sodium, and if you're going calcium chloride and gypsum, then you're going to end up with an overall tinier and minerally beer. But something that we do, and you'll actually notice that if you look at the water profile for the Castor Muncher, is we actually include sodium chloride on purpose, because that sodium does offer a dynamic mouthfeel and a roundness to the overall malt profile, which is typical of, like you said, a lot of those German style lagers. They have some sodium in there, and that does actually impact how the profile of the beer comes across.
Yeah. So lastly, another reason why a lager can really say a lot about a brewery is doing the classic, I call it the warm beer test, which I've done with my own beers at home. And it is amazing what happens and what really changes in a beer flavor profile as you actually let it sit on the counter for 15 or 20 minutes. Let the beer warm up, let the beer open up. Things will come through, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. Unfortunately, a lot of times for the worse. And you can actually do this with any beer. But let the beer warm up. I know most of us are serving our beers, close to 34, 35 degrees just to get them to pour right. But really, you should be drinking those beers warmer. And if you let a beer warm up to, say, even 45 or even 50 degrees, yes, that beer might start going a little flat on you. But if that beer still tastes super, super clean, still very drinkable.
And balanced.
There we go. Yeah. Then it means that the brewer did their job. It means that, if you're doing it with your homebrew, it means that you did a really good job, because the other thing that happens as a beer warms up is any kind of off flavors that might be in the beer will really open up as well.
Yep.
And so while at cold temperatures, those might be suppressed, at warm temperatures, those really come through, and they come through pretty strongly if they're there. So, so give it a test. If you do a lager at home, if you think that you have a local brewery that does a really good lager, pour a pint of it and let it warm up for a little bit, and then give her the old the warm beer test.
Heck yeah. Let's go through some comments really quick. Someone said, nice social distancing. Thanks for noticing. Some people were late and they missed beer church. Viva la beer. We've got some Viva la beers out there.
Apparently
nice.
We do beer church.
Someone says, I wonder how making a lager with Flint tap water would taste. Probably not the best.
It might be a little flinty. That's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah, well, because everyone knows beer in Michigan doesn't taste good.
Oh. Sorry, Milwaukee. Wait, that's not in Michigan, is it?
No.
It's like, wait. Never mind, wrong state.
We're brewers, not geometrists, geographists.
Geographists.
Add more.
Norway has fantastic tap water. That is good to know. I would expect that from Norway, though.
Yeah,
that was.
The more water you can get from like natural sources, a lot of our water actually comes from glacial melt-off, and it runs in an underground aquifer. So we have a little bit of filtration from our natural aquifer.
Yeah. Spokane's really got some crazy water here, actually. In fact, north of us, it's literally a river of water that runs down from from all the snow melt 50 miles north up in the mountains, and it hits this big layer of unconsolidated rocks, and you can actually see it pouring out into the Spokane River in various areas.
My son wants to know if he can come to the shop now because he heard that the Easter Bunny hid some eggs.
Really, Peter? Yes, you can come to the shop in 30 minutes.
Yeah, just wait a little bit. We're going to give Dryden a head start on finding all the eggs.
All right. Anyway, though, let's get back. Let's finish up this topic before we open it up to general questions.
Different fermentation techniques. Is that what we're on? We already hit water chemistry, right?
Yep, hit water chemistry. Yeah, so let's talk about the different fermentation techniques that breweries use, but you can also apply at home to your own batches.
Yeah, so we already talked about different strains of lager yeasts, and those different strains of lager yeast definitely have their own profiles that'll go with go with the yeast specifically, but you can also apply different techniques to kind of build different profiles. First of all is just the original low and slow. You have one yeast, one temperature. You ferment it at 48 to 53 degrees, and you let it ride there the entire time.
Yep, so this is going to take usually about 6 weeks for a primary fermentation. This is something you're going to have to be patient on. Just because of that cold temperature, the yeast is just going to kind of fall down to the bottom and sit there and slowly chug along. It might even take longer if you are brewing a high gravity beer, something like a Baltic Porter or an Eisbach, somewhere in that range.
Honestly, with doing those higher gravity beers, I almost always recommend some sort of a ramping. But you can still low and slow if you have a beastly enough yeast.
Yep. And then so low and slow, it'll still go through a VDK rest if you're doing that method. You don't have to worry about pulling it up for a VDK rest. It's going to happen. It's just going to happen over the course of a couple weeks instead of 24 hours, which is what it usually takes.
Make sure your yeast are still on there. Make sure your yeast are still active. And then also, it doesn't hurt to just in general pick a non-VDK or a low VDK producing yeast in the first place.
Yeah, that never hurts anything. So the second method, which is one that's very, very commonly used, one throughout the brewing industry, but also more and more at home these days. And that is sort of the quick lagering method, which is where you are going to pitch your yeast warm for the most part, usually lowish mid 60s, and you're going to basically let them get started. Give them about a 24-hour start. And as soon as you start seeing that fermentation going, you're actually going to then drop your temperature down into that sort of 50-degree range for about a week. During that week, you're going to go through the majority of your fermentation. You'll probably get 80% of the way through it. And at that point, you'll actually ramp the temperature back up to your mid-60s and let it go for usually 2 to 3 days. And what that's going to do is it's going to just kind of help finish that beer up. And then it's also going to go through its visceral diketone rest. Vicinal, not visceral.
Vicinal. Hey, you got it.
I caught myself on that time. I always call it visceral. Yeah, it's so visceral.
Visceral.
Yeah, which is going to prevent any kind of diacetyl from forming.
Yeah, diacetyl or pentanedione.
And so you go through that rest for a few days. At that point, the beer is effectively done, and then you can drop it down to your lagering temperatures, your mid-30s, and let that beer lager for another couple of weeks before it is ready to tap and drink.
Yeah. There's two really good parts about doing this whole kind of ramping technique, this basically fermentation temperature schedule. Number one is you can still make really clean, good beers, but you can make them a little bit faster. Number two, obviously with the VDK rest, you're reducing your risk of any sort of diacetyl, so you don't have to worry about being patient at that lower temperature. And number three, you can actually sometimes end up with a drier or it makes it easier for your yeast to completely ferment the beer. So you lower your risk of your yeast dropping out before it wants to finish up the beer.
So lastly, the simplest technique is just to do a warm fermentation using a yeast strain like 3470. Also, I believe S33, maybe 23. Yeah, don't quote me on that though. But I believe that's another strain that can ferment high and still stay clean.
Cal Lager is the OG, like everyone knew it could ferment warm because it got popular fermenting
Cal Lager. And so those I just shoot for a temperature range somewhere in the low 60s, say 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Just let it go through a typical fermentation like you would with any ale that you're brewing, and then let it condition in a keg. You might have to fine it if you want to turn it over a little bit. Fining with gelatin, Kieselsaal, whatever your choice
combo
is there.
Of Kieselsaal and Kitasan like
Kitasan. You can filter it if you're really feeling frisky. I don't like filtering though. I feel like that scrubs out too much flavor a lot of times.
Yeah, we'll filter if we want to cheat, and sometimes we do. A lot of times filtering is good if we really want to clarify a beer and then add back flavoring. Add back flavoring that doesn't necessarily cause haziness, because something like a fruit would add a lot of haziness, and so we wouldn't filter in that case. But if we're adding something like, I don't know, chocolate flavor or caramel flavor or even coffee beans sometimes, we need to get a beer out quickly. Filtering is a good idea for those.
Yep. Oh, and then I guess I did forget one more technique that is going to be a little more difficult for most homebrewers, but on the commercial side of things, if people have uni-tanks, is a very feasible thing, and that is pressure fermenting.
So if you have a spunning valve, which a lot of SS brew tanks come fitted in a way that you can buy their spunning valve as well, you can set that spunning valve to 8 to 12 psi, as high as 15 psi, but usually that's a little bit too much because you don't want to supercarbonate your beer and explode your yeast. But set that to 8 to 15 psi and just let it naturally off gas as it's fermenting.
Yeah, the theory behind pressure fermenting is that it slows down the overall growth and divisions of your yeast cells. And as a result, it means that they're producing less of those flavor components in your beer and resulting in a cleaner beer. So in theory, you can take a lager strain that might be a little bit too fruity or a little bit too weird at higher temperatures and actually ferment those at the higher temperatures and still get a clean beer. With that said, there's been mixed results. So, give it a try. Let us know how it goes at home. All right, well, at this point, I think that sums up our All About Lagers, and we are going to open things up to our general questions.
Yeah.
And
we have 69 watching right now, so high five. Give a like for the fact that there are 69 people watching.
Jesus, Peter.
What? That's important.
And I already saw a question about filtering our water and whether or not we run it through a carbon filter and how that might affect breweries versus the homebrew scale of things. And I think it all depends on your water realistically. Carbon filters are going to help absorb chlorine specifically, but chlorine is something that we don't really worry too much about here. You can use Camden tablets as well. Camden will help with chloramines.
Chloramines.
Yeah, chloramines.
Chloramines are going to be the biggest problem. And a good reason to use either a carbon filter or Camden tablets. We don't personally need to because we have our water is treated with diatomic chlorine. The same stuff in bleach, but that also means it evaporates, and so we don't worry too much about it. That actually kind of goes into, though, somebody was mentioning the Arizona water is over 300 parts per million of calcium on a good day. That's very high in calcium.
That is a lot.
One thing that you can do besides a carbon filter will dramatically reduce that calcium, but you can also pre-boil. If you have a equal amount of bicarbonate, boiling your water before you actually brew with it will sediment out a lot of that calcium carbonate. You'll end up with flakes.
Yep. Also, if you can pre-acidulate your water too before you pre-boil it, the pre-boiling will slake it out, so that'll help reduce your overall bicarbonate load as well. But
adding acid will help it.
But adding acid will also really help to precipitate out that calcium, and that's dissolved calcium. That's a lot of dissolved calcium. I wonder if they're talking about it in bicarbonate, because I feel like that's
parts per million. So calcium's got to come from something. So it's got to be some level of.
Anyway, fun facts for water chemistry.
Yeah.
A lot of times there's calcium in the form of calcium carbonate or calcium bicarbonate, but then there's also the dissolved calcium, the calcium ion, which is actually pretty good to have. That really helps with mash. You definitely need some of that in there, but your bicarbonate can definitely make things start tasting pretty chalky. Which I think, I would imagine the geology of Arizona, I think that's probably what they're talking about.
The biggest thing I would look into is whether or not you have chlorine or chloramine, and that might help you figure out what you need to do to reduce it. Because if you have chloramines, carbon filter is probably just going to be your easiest way to both reduce your water minerals and get rid of the chloramines.
Yeah.
What are some of the flavors of milk stouts that you have come across? Ooh, a lot. I think Southern Tier has done the best overall, like round flavor, like big flavored milk stouts. They've done creme brulee. They've done all sorts of different like caramel editions, coffee, espresso.
Go big or go home with milk stouts.
Oh yeah.
Anyone that wants to drink a milk stout is expecting
sweet.
Yeah, they're expecting sweet. They're expecting like a rich beer to just explode with flavor. And I've had too many milk stouts that you have them and you're like, this is just kind of like a run-of-the-mill stout. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Milk stouts by themselves, like lactose honestly isn't that interesting of a flavor by itself. So having a great stout with some lactose in it is kind of boring. That's the same thing with milkshake IPAs. A lot of people are actually adding lactose to IPAs just to kind of give that roundness and sweetness to balance out the hops. But it's not really a milkshake IPA, or it's not something interesting or different until you add a lot of fruit to it.
They're
probably same kind of thing with milk stouts.
Yeah, milk stouts are probably one of the few styles that honestly it's like, I'm like, yeah, just just go for it. Throw the kitchen sink at it, see what happens.
Honestly, doing a milk stout and then adding the flavored coffee beans, the stuff from Tom Sawyer Country Coffee that we use in our cast miniature kits.
Fantastic.
That'd be a phenomenal way to just boost flavor and give you a lot of big balance to your beer, and also add some interestingness.
Throw some coffee. I know a lot of people have played around with actually like toasting like different varieties of nuts as well, toasting pecans and things like that. Maybe even getting a little like caramelized sugary thing going on and throwing that in there.
Toasted coconut.
Oh yeah.
One of the most popular beers in Washington is Dark Persuasion, which is a German chocolate cake beer.
Pretty much.
Have you ever brewed any bitter beers? Not many in the States. Yes, we have brewed bitters. We would love to do more bitters, but we won't probably tackle that until we can get a proper cask system.
Yeah, those beers really are designed to be on cask.
They need to be real ales.
Yeah, and I think that'll actually help them sell too. That's another downside. I actually just had a conversation with a customer yesterday, I think, about English bitters and English milds and how they are fantastic beers. I wish we could brew more of them, but unfortunately, because of their low alcohol content, they don't sell well in a tap room, and it's just one of those sad realities from a commercial standpoint.
Yep. If we got a proper beer engine and we made a whole thing of it, and we're like, hey, by the way, we're super good at cask, then we could blow bitters out the water all day. But since we're a regular tap room that's got a lot of people walking in, the first question that 90% of the people that walk in that don't know about us ask is, what IPAs did you have on tap? And last week that was none.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things, like we like to brew what we like to brew, but at the same time, sometimes we got to brew what we know people are going to buy.
So here's a really good question. Somebody is asking about the disadvantages of having higher adjunct to malt ratio if we hit our numbers. So that's so what I'm guessing is that when you're hitting your numbers, it means you're hitting a target gravity and you're hitting a target color. And I think that all really depends on the beer. Some beers are going to have really high adjunct loads. Things like Kentucky Commons come to mind. That might actually be like 50% or even more adjuncts, like pretty crazy high adjuncts, which you just need to make sure your base malt has enough enzymes to do its thing for you.
Well, I guess it depends on the adjuncts too.
Yeah.
Because like corn is going to be, like gelatinized corn is going to be super, super easy to rip out all those sugars. But if it's, let's say, flaked wheat or even flaked barley or something like that, then the sugars will be very hard to get out. But disadvantages if you hit your numbers, so I guess that's assuming that all the enzymes go correctly.
Yeah.
The biggest disadvantage I would say is just flavor imbalance.
Yeah, you can end up with a beer that's going to be really, really thick or blown out if, say, you're using, some other, like some really, really dark specialty malt.
Rye might be an issue. Rye can get very pumpernickel-y.
Yep, very pumpernickel-y, and or stuck mashes if you're using anything flaked. Yeah, I mean, it depends. We definitely like the idea, especially for lighter beers. Speaking of lagers like we did today, we like to add more of a slightly higher color base malt versus a high color, a small amount of, say, a high color adjunct malt. And it really just comes down to the flavor balance and what you're trying to achieve there. Some beers, it's totally appropriate. I don't see any disadvantages at all. For beers like pale lagers, might not be the better way to go.
Someone says, careful, we have great water in Michigan, sans Flint.
Yeah, I know.
I was joking. I know nothing about Michigan water. Someone asked if you put too much Irish moss in the last 15 minutes of the boil. I don't think you're actually, it said when you put it in, it smelled like the sea. That makes sense because it's seaweed. But I don't think it's actually going to affect your flavor of your beer because it'll probably precipitate out. The downside of adding too much is if you add a lot of carrageenan, it actually becomes a haze forming protein in itself. So where normally it's designed to grab onto other proteins and drop them out, giving you a clear beer. If you add too much, you might end up getting the opposite effect. That said, I think you'd have to add a lot of too much to make that happen. So someone responded, just call it a goza. I actually really like that idea. I would love to do like an actual like sea kind of flavored beer, like where it's not just the salt of the sea, like a goza, but you actually have that like how Islay scotches have those that kind of Islay scotches are aged seaside. They're aged like right next to the shore, and so they get that kind of seaweed flavor. That'd be fun.
So if it's RC, we just need to get like a bunch of creosote-soaked pilings, and then like some like really muddy profile going on.
I think we have to smoke it. Maybe that should be our next Stein beer.
Oh God. But somebody's asking about oils and throwing like baked goods like donuts into mashes, and we've done it before.
Yeah.
And I think that is the trick is, you're saying baked goods like donuts. A lot of those aren't going to have a ton of oils. I guess the donuts might on the outside. And I think the reality of when you see, I'm going to call them gimmicks like that, is that whoever's brewing with them might throw in a dozen boxes of donuts into, let's say, a 5-barrel batch of beer. Yes, you're going to get some oil in there. It's going to be such a negligible amount of oil that it really shouldn't affect anything. With that said, if you're throwing 5 dozen donuts into your 5-gallon batch of beer, it might be a different situation.
It's going to be very hard to ferment, and it's also probably going to lose all forms of head retention.
Yeah, and really, actually, I think that's also the thing, is that a little bit of oil really shouldn't affect the flavor of the beer so much as it just might end up not having any head retention and having like a slightly weird looking film when you're drinking it.
A small amount of oil actually in the mash, so the husks of the mash, or the grainy part of the mash, actually will absorb some of those oils. So that's one of the reasons to do it, because the filter bed, the oil or the mash itself will filter out some of the oil. That said, any oil that goes into the boil or fermentation, that's going to be a problem for you. And too much oil in the mash, because it can't filter out a ton of oil, but too much oil in the mash can definitely be an issue.
Yeah. Somebody's asking about whether or not we were concerned about water chemistry when we started homebrewing, and at least for me, the answer is a resounding absolutely not. I was concerned about figuring out how to make beer. I don't know if did you do that right off the bat?
When I started homebrewing, I was actually down in my college town, and I started homebrewing when I was working for a homebrew supply store. When I started getting serious, I should say. The first couple of times I homebrewed, I was 19 to 20, and so no, of course not.
Yeah, exactly. You're just like, sweet, like that's cool. I made a beer. It didn't taste awful. I should probably make another one.
Pretty much. And but when I got into actual homebrewing when I was 21, doing it for serious, I was part of a homebrew club where the majority of the people were college students and or professors. And so you kind of got a different crowd right there. A lot of them are very, very analytical about everything they do. And so those people definitely kind of said, by the way, water chemistry is a thing very early on. I want to say by my 4th or 5th batch of beer, I was already thinking about water chemistry. I didn't take it seriously probably until my 30th or 40th batch of beer though. So.
Yeah. I think for me, what turned me on to water chemistry was it was about the time I think I started working here. And I was brewing very commonly, almost every single week with a buddy of mine that actually lived a few blocks up from me. And what I noticed is that we had a thing where when either one of us brewed a dark beer, we basically couldn't screw up on it.
Yeah.
And but we also were experimenting with a ton of hops at the time. But we noticed that even though we were throwing a lot of times a half pound or more of hops into a 5-gallon batch of beer, loading them up at the end like modern day hazies are before they were actually a thing, and we noticed that they just didn't come through like we thought they should. And that's really when I started looking into water chemistry, because I was going, there's got to be something here. Like, why is it that my hops all fall flat? And that's really when I started looking into it and started playing with it. And sure enough, turns out that we also have a really high level of bicarbonate. Somebody's saying in Arizona, my bicarbonate level is like 250 parts per million in Chini, and that actually will take any kind of hop profile and just flatten that out to nothing and scrub out all the flavor from it. I started cutting my water in half with distilled water, upping my sulfates a little bit, and next thing you know, I brewed an IPA that literally, if I did not believe it came from my household, that's how different it made the beer taste. And at that point on, it was like water chem all the way. So
find what your water does, what beers your water makes good, and then you know what you can kind of where you can work around. And then when it comes to branching outside of those and really trying to nail styles outside of that, then go ahead and play with your water chemistry. Use RO water and build up or whatever you want to do. Someone's asking, Imperial just put out Julius seasonal strain. Any experience or thoughts about best uses? No,
I'll let you know next week, because I'm going to be putting in my order today. So
yeah, we'll get some in. We'll
Thank
try
you
it
for
out.
the reminder, though. I probably would have forgotten. My wife told me about that the other day. I was like, oh yeah, I should put those on the order.
We've got to get some Brett on the order too. We've got a lot of yeast we got to get ordered.
Yeah, we got a lot of
souring
yeast
stuff we got to make
if
happen.
anyone watching owns a commercial brewery and wants to split a 5-barrel pitch with us, they got all kinds of fun strains to work with. So.
Should you rack/decant off the flakes, or are they just not an issue after they've precipitated? I don't like putting that's talking about when you boil and you precipitate out your calcium and bicarbonate. It's probably not going to do anything because once they've precipitated out, they're generally, things are only going to get more acidic in your brew day, so they're going to stay precipitated out more often than not. That said, I usually don't like putting them in my mash because it doesn't feel right. I don't have a scientific explanation for why. So rack/decant off them, even though it probably won't make a difference.
Yeah.
Recipes on L17. L17, is that global?
L17 is, I believe that is global. It's either global or harvest. I got global. I think global's L13, isn't it? Yes. I believe that's harvest. I got it right here. I guess I can look at it. Yeah, L17's harvest.
Harvest is a phenomenal yeast that can produce nice, purposeful fruity esters at a warmer temperature. So I guess pitfalls would be if you're trying to make something super, super bright and neutral, then don't ferment it warm. That said, it has a wide temperature range, and we've used it probably above its specified temperature range, and it tastes really, really good. But you can also make a really nice clean beer with L17 if you ferment it low and slow.
Yeah. Somebody's got actually a really great question about hops and your flame out additions and basically doing hop stands with them. And they're asking if you are letting the beer sit hot for a hop stand, wouldn't that affect your bittering additions and any boil additions as a result? And the answer is yes, but not very much. It turns out that your hop isomerization or your bittering utilization drops off very, very rapidly. Pretty much to the point where once you get anywhere below about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, you're actually getting hardly any utilization. So to put things into perspective, a 200 degree hop stand might only yield a utilization rate of maybe like 2 or 3% over the course of your 30 minutes, whereas your 10-minute boil addition is going to give you probably 5 times more than that. So the answer is yes, but really not very much, and that's really why you don't calculate that as part of your IBUs. Lastly, we got just a couple more questions here. We do got to open up sooner than later. Well, actually in 11 minutes to be exact. But somebody's asking about alkaline water and really what kind of impact that has on our brewing. Peter, you got it?
Alkaline water and what that impact that has on our brewing?
Yeah.
So the number one thing that has on our brewing is making it so that amber to dark beers, at least are you talking about our water specifically? Or
no, somebody's talking about water in general, yeah.
If you have alkaline water, so you're going to be really good at making those darker ambers to porter stouts kind of range very, very easily. Yeah. Part of that comes from mash chemistry. Just your darker malts are going to balance out your mash chemistry really, really, really well. But also the way that those produce kind of a bolder mouthfeel that stands up more to those stronger flavors that come with dark malts. Usually, generally speaking, you're going to have thicker beers with darker beers. They're going to have a little bit more general astringency because of the roast malts. They're going to be some caramely sweetness going on there. And so when you have that extra minerality from having more alkaline water, there's things that go in that, like bicarbonate. You're just it's gonna balance out a lot better. On the flip side, if you made something super, super light and that finishes dry with really alkaline water, you'll notice the texture of the water a lot more in the beer. And especially if that ends up being hoppy, then you've got aggressive texture from the water, you've got aggressive texture / mouthfeel from the hop bitterness, and then you've got a really light base, and everything seems kind of out of balance. And so I think alkaline water is good for darker beers.
Simple fix if you do want to make lighter beers, dilute it down a little bit. If you can, and also I think like somebody actually already threw up there, is just kind of be aware of your pH levels. It wouldn't be a terrible idea to get a pH meter to check your mash on the lighter beers. You're probably going to have to add a little bit of lactic acid to your mash and or acidulated malt, which is something that we personally love to use in a lot of our lighter beers. It'll just help drop that pH down. But also the grains themselves, it depends on a lot of things there going on. It also depends on your, what is it called? The reserve alkalinity?
Residual alkalinity.
Residual alkalinity.
Residual alkalinity is
which is different.
That's the ability of your water to buffer against pH change. And so You can have a pH 8 water that'll adjust pretty quickly with the malts that you throw in because they have acidity. You can also have pH 8 water that will resist that change in pH.
Yeah.
So depending on the minerals that are in there.
Yeah, look a little bit into it, but otherwise, yeah, adding a little bit of
actual acid.
Distilled water to overall kind of reduce your mineral load, and a little bit of acidulated malt. Just go ahead and give it a test for your next light beer you make and see how that turns out.
Did you get you got the hop set flame out question done?
Yep.
Sweet. 38 and fermenting right now. Decent hard seltzers with inferred sugar instead of dextrose. That wouldn't be a hard seltzer at that point, but that would be something.
Sounds good to me, honestly.
Yeah. So any way that you can add complexity, it's going to become more mead-like or more cider-like. Invert sugars. They have a little bit of caramelization that goes on. They also have the acid component, and so they generally tend to be more complex. Invert sugars also. They create some fruity esters just based on how yeast ferment them, and so that would be a more pleasant and dynamic beverage than traditional hard seltzers, which is dextrose, nutrient, and then flavor it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in.
No, you guys all thank each other.
And today, thank each other. Please hit the like button on this video before we call this a wrap. That is another live session.
Live stream.
From Genus. I think next week what we might actually try to do is something a little bit different. I think we're going to try to do a live stream of just basic extract beers. So if you know anyone that is thinking about getting into home brewing, please pass that word along. We're going to be doing a live stream.
We'll still answer questions, but it'll involve us actually brewing on site and live, if that sounds good to you guys.
Yep.
So I'm going to rattle off a couple quick answers real quick. pH adjustment before or after adding malt. I always add my pH adjustment to my malts personally, but you can do it in your water as well. Nutrient and promoting rapid fermentation. We add yeast nutrient at the same time we add yeast, usually. Although in high alcohol beers, we'll add it multiple times. Someone caught wild yeast and made sourdough. Was really good. That's awesome. Is hard seltzer basically sugar wash? Yes.
All right.
Chest freezer, inkbird fermentation control. Yes, you do not have to keg cold. You can keg warm and crash your beer. So keg warm and then go ahead and throw it in your chest freezer. And that should cover all the questions. Boom.
We're done.
Thank you. We'll see you next week. And
8:45 Pacific Standard Time.
Think of questions that you got. We'll be there. You'll be square. Hi.
Happy Easter. And it's tea time. Sweet. We got 6 minutes to do mop and